Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So last week we talked about the Prophet ﷺ being raised the first 4 years of his life in the outskirts of Mecca with Halima Sa'diyah. And then we also talked about the incident of Shaq al-Sadr, the splitting of the chest of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it's an important incident. There's a lot of wisdoms behind the incident because it tells us about the upcoming responsibility of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam bearing the weight of revelation and the responsibility of revelation. After being returned to Amina, the mother of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, at the age of 4, the Prophet Muhammad stayed with his mother for about 2 to almost 3 years until her passing. And so at the tender age of 6 years old, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam lost both of his parents. And as is commonly known, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam lost his father before he was even born. And we mentioned this last week, and I mentioned here again, but everything that happened to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was by divine decree. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fixed the Prophet ﷺ's life experiences into this beautiful divine plan so that it would serve as a lesson for the coming generations. So the fact that Rasulullah ﷺ lost both of his parents is not a coincidence. The fact that 2 of the nursing mothers of Rasulullah ﷺ that we mentioned last week, Thawayba and Ayman, also known as Baraka, were African. 2 of the mothers of Rasulullah ﷺ are individuals that at this time the Arab society looked down on, because the Arab society prided themselves on their ethnicity. This is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that these were the people who shaped the greatest person that has ever come to existence. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was an orphan from a very young age, from the time he was born, to show us that there should be no negative connotation attached to being an orphan. If you think about it, Rasulullah ﷺ was the first orphan of this ummah. He is the first orphan of this ummah. So there should be no negative connotation or indignity attached to orphans. And there's also an emotional consultation to anyone who might end up in this difficult situation of being an orphan, and even also an emotional consultation to those who maybe they're older but they lose their parents. That Rasulullah ﷺ lost his parents at a young age. Rasulullah ﷺ lost his parents at a time where it was crucial for him to have parents, and he was able to bear it, and he's our example. And so no person should ever feel like any less of a human being because of these circumstances, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself, the greatest human being, was an orphan. And we as a society, we also need to look at orphans similarly. When we look at an orphan, we'll be reminded of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That if we ever have the opportunity to care, to show consideration, to show love to an orphan, it's almost like we're showing care, consideration, love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had the most potential. And oftentimes when we look at society, we look at those who are disenfranchised like an orphan, and we say that, oh, you know, they're not really going to be able to amount to anything. They don't have the same opportunities. They don't have the same capabilities as everybody else, so best of luck. That's not true. The truth is some of the greatest people in the world are orphans, and that's why they're in the circumstances they're in. Some of the most spiritual, righteous people are orphans in the world, because that is why they're in the circumstances that they're in. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a common saying, that God tests his most beloved soldiers with the hardest tests. And we look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Last week we talked about how the Prophet ﷺ was, the narration said, no one has been tested more than I have. No one has gone through more pain than I have. And Rasulullah ﷺ is the most beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts people in tests, puts people in situations and predicaments to increase their rank, to increase their piety and righteousness. You know, in the summer of 2018, Alhamdulillah, I was blessed with an opportunity to go visit Jordan and go visit some of our Syrian and Palestinian brothers and sisters overseas. And during this trip, we spent some time in the Mafraq camp, which is on the border of Syria. And there was a lot of Syrian refugees that were there. There's this one young man in particular that I will always remember. His name is Khalid. And when we went there, and me and some of my colleagues, we were playing soccer in the scorching hot desert sun with some of these kids. And it was very rough. And there was this one boy named Khalid who was destroying everybody, 12 years old at the time, killing everybody on the soccer field or in the desert area. And we were dying of heat, and it seemed like all the kids were just used to it, and they were running around for hours and hours on end. Now, Khalid was on my team, and him and I built a good connection, good team chemistry, even though I suck at soccer. I don't know how. I would just pass it to him, and he would do his thing. When he found out I was Egyptian, he started calling me Salah, right, like Muhammad Salah. I don't even think he knew my real name, to be honest. And so after the match was over, we had our fun, we played our soccer. He wanted to invite me over to his home. So he says, come to my home. And he takes me to this small tent. Small tent that's no bigger than between these two pillars right here. And he takes me into this tent and he shows me this is the corner where my mom sleeps. This is the corner where my sister sleeps. This is the corner where I sleep. And in the other corner, there was this box. And I look into the box and I see that there's water in there. And he walks over to that box of water and he grabs it, tells me to sit down, and then he gives me a water bottle. Then I look at the box again and I see that it's empty, meaning it was the last water bottle. And this is in a place where they don't know when the next water is going to come. Alhamdulillah, there are organizations like Helping Hand for Relief and Development, Islamic Relief, Penny, all these good organizations that come every once in a while and supply them with water, so they know that eventually something's going to come, inshallah, but they don't know when. And he's giving it to me. And so I'm fighting back and forth with him, and I'm saying, no, 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 absolutely not, absolutely, absolutely not. But he's consistent, he's persistent. You know what he says to me? He says that, how can I host my guests? What kind of host would I be if I don't serve my guests water? 12 years old, 12-year-old boy. So eventually we compromised, and I said, I'll take half, and he takes half, and he agreed. Afterwards, I asked him, why were you so persistent in this matter? And he said, you know, he was joking with me. He says, I've lived my entire life, or last 6 years of my life, in this desert. I was been here since I was 6 years old. After my father was killed in the Syrian war, we ran over here and we sought refuge here, and I've been here for 6 years. I'm used to this place. You, however, you're an American, and you're weak. And I can tell that you're struggling out here, so you needed the water more than I do. And he was actually right. Anyway, so Khalid and I, we bonded over the course of the trip, and it was time for us to leave. And I kneel down to say my salams to Khalid, and he says to me, he puts his hand on my shoulder as if to comfort me. And he says, you know, Salah, again, I'm pretty sure he didn't know my real name. When am I ever going to see you again? And I wanted to be honest with him. I said, you know, I don't know. I don't know. But I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us an opportunity to meet again, and hopefully in a better circumstance. You know what he says to me? And this is how I knew that, you know, there's something special that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in the hearts of these individuals. He says, I don't want you to worry, because I'm going to pray all my prayers. I'm going to fast all my fasts. I'm going to take care of my mom and my sister like it's my duty to, as the man of the house, to do. 12 years old, saying this. He says, so that one day, inshallah, when I go to Jannah, I'll ask for you there, and we can play soccer together in Jannah. There's something special. There's the potential of greatness in individuals like this. So we have to remember that. If we ever have the opportunity to take care of an orphan, to love an orphan, to support an orphan, not only should we want or hesitantly or, okay, I'll do it. No, we should be eager to do something like that. Urgently jump at the opportunity to take care of an orphan. So Rasulullah ﷺ from the age of 4 to 6 is being taken care of his mother Amina. And after the Prophet ﷺ was returned to his mother, he started to have normal experiences of a child of his age. He begins to learn how to dress himself, begins to learn how to feed himself. And Amina, the mother of Rasulullah ﷺ, was very well known in her community. She was very well known for being probably the most intelligent out of all the women. She was very gifted in poetry. She was very well versed in the history of her people. She was a very intellectually, strong woman of high regard, well respected. And this is, again, not a coincidence. We talk about the divine decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't provide the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with just an ordinary human being for a mother. But he provided a very intelligent, cultured, sophisticated woman to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which directly contributed to his upbringing. So every person who had a major influence on the Prophet ﷺ during his formative years was a person of very high moral ethics, high character and great conduct. The grandfather of Rasulullah ﷺ, Abdul Muttalib, was the leader of his tribe. And generally, a person of leadership tends to be wealthy. Historically speaking, a person of leadership tends to be wealthy. Even if it's not corrupt, sometimes it's corrupt wealth, but even if it's not corrupt, the fact that someone's a leader means they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of connections. So even the opportunities to become wealthy for a leader is significantly greater than someone who's not a leader. But Abdul Muttalib, at times he was actually broke. Abu Talib, at times he was actually broke, very poor. And the reason being is because they were cautious. Abdul Muttalib was very particular that he never wanted to take advantage of his influences and connections as a leader to make him wealthy. Rather, he wanted to use his influence as a connection as a leader to make sure that his people are taken care of. And his son, Abu Talib, was exactly the same way, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle. And Abu Talib's son, Ali radiallahu anh, was raised in the house of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Talib, Ali radiallahu anh was born after Abu Talib was pretty elder in age, so he didn't have the same stamina and energy to take care of a young child like Ali radiallahu anh. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wanting to support, wanting to help his uncle, he actually steps in and he ends up almost raising Ali radiallahu anh himself. And this was his way of financially assisting Abu Talib, right? Because he didn't have the necessary means to raise all of his children all the time. So Amina and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ went to Medina, and they were accompanied by Ayman, who is also known as Barakah. Right? Barakah is probably one of the most influential women in the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And there are varying narrations as to why Amina decided to take this trip. And they went to visit family while they were there. First of all, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had second and third uncles that lived in Quba, which is right outside, it's like a suburb right outside of Yathrib. At that time called Yathrib, but modern day is called Medina. And so Quba is also where the first masjid after the revelation of the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, was built, Masjid al-Quba. Abdul Muttalib, his maternal relatives are from Quba as well. So Amina wanted to meet his wanted the Prophet ﷺ to meet his extended relatives. This is one of the reasons. The other reason why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's mother, Amina, wanted him to visit Medina or Yathrib at the time was because who passed away there? Does anybody remember? No one? His father. Rasulullah ﷺ's father passed away in Medina. And the Amina knew where the Prophet ﷺ's father had been buried, so it's quite possible, and actually most likely, that the reason why is because Amina wanted the Prophet ﷺ to meet his father and see the grave of his father. So Amina traveled those 300 kilometers from Mecca to Yathrib to visit her late husband's grave. Now, just a reminder for everybody, when I say Yathrib, I'm just saying it in the context of the time, just to follow the timeline. But the scholars mention that you're not supposed to call Medina Yathrib, right? Modern day is called Medina. So outside of this classroom, don't be calling it Yathrib. It is Medina Manawara. But for the sake of the timeline and for the sake of the narrative of the story, that is why it will be mentioned in this class Yathrib before it becomes Medina. So Amina traveled on this journey, and they stayed for some time in Quba with Abdul Muttalib's family and in Yathrib, and they visited Abdullah's grave, and they stayed there for about a month. Now it's mentioned in Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'd that much later on, during the Madani period of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when the Prophet was in his late 50s or his early 60s-ish, the Prophet ﷺ passed by the house of Banu Adi, which is a family of the tribe of Al-Khazraj. And while walking around in Medina, he stopped and pointed to a house. And he told his Sahaba, this is the same house where my mother and I stayed when we visited Medina in my childhood. And then the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he pointed to a pond that was near that house, and he said that this is the same pond in which I learned how to swim. And then he pointed to an open field, and he said, this is the same field where I ran around and I played with other kids during my visit. So he remembered this visit when he was young. And it's mentioned in Ibn Ishaq and Bayhaqi and Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi, where Ayman recalled an incident while they were there in Yathrib, that she was sitting with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when randomly there was two Jewish men who approached him. And the men asked, where is the child Ahmad? We would like to see him. Now remember from previous we talked about how Amina, the mother of Rasulullah ﷺ, actually preferred to call the Prophet Muhammad Ahmad. So it's very possible that the people in Medina know him as Ahmad. And he's also mentioned as Ahmad in previous scriptures as well. And so Ayman showed them where the Prophet ﷺ was, and they looked at the child and they basically examined the child. They turned his back and they saw the seal of prophethood, the mark of prophethood that we talked about last week, that is between his shoulder blades. And so one of the men said to the other that this is the prophet of our nation. This is going to be the prophet of our times. In this city, Yathrib, he will migrate here. This will be his Dar al-Hijrah. This will be where he migrates to. And then they also said that there will be great battles and many prisoners that will be taken that will be revolved around this child. Right? What they're saying, they're referring to the Madani period of the Prophet ﷺ, because there was a lot of battles that happened at that time. There was wars, there was prisoners, there was conflicts, and we'll get to all that inshallah ta'ala in the near future. Now when Amina was informed about this entire conversation, she got kind of frightened, as any mother would. And so she worried for the safety of her child, and they immediately packed up their bags and they began to leave from Medina. Now on the way back, or leave Medina for Mecca, sorry. Now on the way back, Amina, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and Ayman are traveling together. Now, whether Amina was sick before leaving Medina or she became sick on the journey is unclear. But they stopped in a place called Maqam Abu Wa, where Amina's sickness became to be very severe. Very high fever, very difficult, and her health began to deteriorate. And once they left Yathrib, which is about 23 miles is where they, 23 miles away from Medina was where the small town of Abu Wa is, she wasn't feeling well. But she left anyways. She tried to push through anyways, because a mother will do anything to protect her child. A mother will do anything to do what is best for her child. So during the journey back to Mecca, Amina's health worsened. So they were forced to stop at Abu Wa. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Ayman tells us that while this was going on, she saw that the Prophet ﷺ was crying. He feared that his mother would leave him. He cried profusely. If you remember, Rasulullah ﷺ is 6 years old at this moment. As Amina's life was passing from one life to the next. And so imagine Rasulullah ﷺ in this moment. Imagine a 6-year-old Rasulullah ﷺ saying to his mother, "Don't go, I only spent 2 years with you. I just started to feel like I'm at home. Your arms are my arms, your heart is my heart, your house is my house, your food is my food. Your embrace is all I want." And Rasulullah ﷺ, all he's doing is he's seeing that hand slip away at the age of 6 years old. And this separation was so difficult on Rasulullah ﷺ that years later, the Prophet, faintly remembering his mother when he was 50 years after this incident, him and the companions, they passed by Maqam Abuha. And he began to cry. And he started crying. And he started crying so much that his beard became soaked with tears. And the companions, they say, فَبَكَى وَأَبْكَى مَنْ حَوْلَهُ, that he started to cry, and when the companions would see the Prophet ﷺ's cry, which was not a usual circumstance, they would begin to cry too. Because they loved the Prophet ﷺ so much, his pain was their pain. And so they saw the pain of that 6-year-old Rasulullah ﷺ in that moment. And the Sahaba recalled, and they said that when the Prophet ﷺ visited his mother's grave in Maqam Abuwa, he said, وَهُوَ سَقِيم, he looked very sick. Another narration says, وَهُوَ ثَقِيل, that he looked very heavy-hearted. It was very tough on Rasulullah ﷺ. And eventually the Prophet ﷺ said that I used to forbid you from visiting graveyards, but you may visit them now. Another report actually states that the Prophet ﷺ was granted permission to visit his mother's grave. And this is very important to note. Note how Rasulullah ﷺ, he did not take a single step without being granted permission, even when it came to visiting his own mother. And so the mercy of this abrogation has been extended to the ummah. And the permissibility of visiting graves was sanctioned, serving as a reminder of the short period, the transience of this life. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ explained to them that I went to the grave of my mother and I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me intercession on her behalf, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refused. Now these are the types of narrations that are used as evidence by people who say that Rasulullah ﷺ's parents may have not been believers. But we talked about this issue before. The opinion that everyone should have with regards to this is Allah knows best. And it's not our business, it's not our place. We won't be asked about it on the grave or in the day of judgment. Now, scholars have discussed this matter for the sake of scholarship, but this isn't something that Rasulullah ﷺ would want us to engage in discussion in. Just think about it. Think about how if your parents had passed away and you heard a group of people talking about whether they're believers or not. That would bring pain to your heart. So the companions didn't necessarily discuss this. This isn't something that they discussed with one another. And so Allah Ta'ala alam bis-sawab, but this is also something that we shouldn't discuss. And inshallah, our hope is that they are going to be in Jannah. That's our hope. And the reason why that's our hope is because we have love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's what he would have wanted. You don't think Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have wanted his parents to be in Jannah? Of course he would have wanted that. Right? So because that's his hope, inshallah, and that's our hope too, inshallah ta'ala. Now, some fiqh discussion here, I guess, a little bit. One of the common practices during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was that when it came to legislation, if there was something that people had a hard time of abandoning their old habit, then that practice would be made completely forbidden. So for example, in the old days, the Arabs would take a vegetable or a fruit such as, squash or like a melon, and they would hollow it out. Then they would put animal grease, animal fat inside that hollow area. Then they would put it out in the sun and they leave it out for days until the grease completely hardens. And what happens is it forms a seal inside the vegetable or the fruit. And so after the container is hardened, the Arabs would use it to put their alcohol in it. right? And they would plug it. And it would keep the alcohol cool. It would keep it fresh. And sometimes they used it for other things like water and milk. But primarily it was used for alcohol. So, when alcohol was first made haram, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made the use in any types of containers also haram. Any types of those containers also haram. So that the companions would remain completely distant from any alcoholic practice. So that there will be no more association with alcohol. Now, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saw that the Sahaba became disciplined and strong enough to the point where alcohol was no longer enticing them, they had basically completely removed their habit and gotten it out of their system, then the Prophet ﷺ reinstated it and made it okay for those containers to be used for water and milk and other permissible things. So now take that example, the same act applies to visiting of graves. Because there's a lot of messed up practices, a lot of grave worship that was happening. So in order to create a distance for grave worshipping, the Prophet ﷺ forbade that the Muslims would even visit graves. Right? Not even visit graves. But when the people became solid in their tawheed, solid in their iman, and la ilaha illallah, then the Prophet allowed the graves to be visited after that. So after Rasulullah ﷺ came to his Sahaba, after visiting his mother's grave, he told the Sahaba, I used to tell you not to visit graves, but go ahead and visit them now. And this story of sadness after visiting his mother's grave carries a valuable lesson for us. No one can ever replace your mother. The Prophet ﷺ was given so many amazing influences in his life. Abdul Muttalib was amazing. Halima Sa'diyah, she was incredible, incredible mother. Abu Talib was incredible. But no one will ever replace the love of a mother, the care of a mother. Her skin will wrinkle, her hair will turn white, but their kiss and embrace will never be replaced. The dua of the mother, it's never rejected. The love of a mother will never turn away. And so the difficulty that he went through cannot be dismissed. We should remember that this is why Rasulullah ﷺ always talked about loving for parents, caring for parents. Jannah lies at the feet of the mother. Too many narrations to count. The mother giving preference 3 times over the husband, or over the father. Right? Narrations that even mention that the status of the mother is even higher than the status of the wife for a man. So much honor that is given to a mother. And you have to think, why is Rasulullah ﷺ constantly drilling into our minds the care of a mother, the care for a parent? Because it was his desire to take care of his parents. His desire to take care of his mother, take care of his father when he was now of older age and is able to. But he couldn't. And that must have hurt Rasulullah ﷺ. So in an effort to see his ummah take care of his parents, take care of their parents, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ الْوَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ, the Prophet ﷺ does not speak anything that isn't true directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why there's so much reward in it. So much reward in caring for our parents. So Ayman narrates that during the last seconds of Amina's life that he was hugging and embracing her. Rasulullah ﷺ was hugging and embracing his mother. And his mother says something to Rasulullah ﷺ. She says to him, do not despair. You were a blessing and an honor for me, and Allah will protect you. And she leaves the dunya. And her grave is still there today in Maqam Mu'ad. And now why Abuwa? Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow Amina to be buried in Medina or in Mecca close to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Allahu a'lam, but it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, don't get attached to people too quickly. That day when your mother passed away, you may have felt completely abandoned. You had no idea what the vision was. But I came through. Your Allah helped you and will always take care of you. أَلَمْ يَجِدَكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى. Did we not find you an orphan and took care of you? So similarly, another lesson here is that when we become carriers of the deen, it's important to keep in touch with our emotions. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, even though he's a prophet, a messenger of Allah, he was not above being someone who showed emotion. He cried openly while sitting at his mother's graves. He cried so much that he became choked up and it was hard for him to breathe. He was audibly crying. There were some Sahaba who saw the Prophet ﷺ cry and they said, we have never seen the Prophet cry like this. And so we started to cry. Umar ibn al-Khattab, he got up and he placed his arm around the Prophet ﷺ, comforting him. And he told the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, we've sat here and listened to you cry. We've watched you cry. What makes you so sad, Ya Rasulullah? The way you cry makes us cry. And then he explained that this is the grave of my mother. And so Rasulullah ﷺ, 50 years later, was so moved by his emotions that he wept so profusely at the memory of his mother. And so this shows us the human side of Rasulullah ﷺ. This was a child who had lost his mother. 15 years after receiving prophethood, after going on the journey of Al-Isra wal Mi'raj, after receiving divine revelation, after being the vessel of miracle after miracle after miracle, and accomplishing so much, at this point when he's crying at the grave of his mother, this man is a hero in everybody's eyes. Literally a superhero. But it shows that the Prophet ﷺ was still a human being. That when he visited his mother's grave, he sat there and cried like any other child would. The human side of Rasulullah ﷺ. And I mention this because one of the points of this seerah is that we connect to Rasulullah ﷺ. And we have trouble connecting because as amazing as he was, because of our own short-sightedness, the Prophet can seem, astaghfirullah, a'udhu billah, unrelatable to us. But he's actually very relatable to us. He's the most relatable. So emphasizing the humanity of the Prophet, the emotional side of the Prophet ﷺ, where he weeps his eyes out while he's sitting at his mother's grave, it does not take anything away from the Prophet ﷺ, it only adds to the seerah. So there's a valuable lesson in this for us. The Prophet ﷺ never allowed himself to be above and beyond emotions. There's no mentality like, nah, I'm a prophet, I'm a messenger of Allah, I'm supposed to deliver the message, I don't have time to sit around here and cry like a little baby. No, absolutely not. The Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asked the Prophet ﷺ to do many things, many difficult things. He had to bear a lot of heavy things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tasked him with. But one thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never asked the Prophet ﷺ to do was give up his emotions. Never asked him to do that. He remained in touch with his emotions. He stayed connected with his family. So we have to keep that in mind. Because sometimes on our journey to become more spiritual and more pious, we think that it means that I have to rise above emotions. I have to let things not bother me. If someone in my family passes away, I just have to act heartless and just be like, sabr, that's it. And be stone cold. And yes, there are some etiquettes of the way we do things and some etiquettes of the way we mourn a death versus not. And that's all a different discussion. But if you're saddened by a death, no one should say, what's wrong with you? You don't have sabr? You don't have taqwa? You don't have tawakkul? Why are you crying? No. Rasulullah ﷺ cried over his mother. I can too. So this is what makes him the greatest example. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes back to Mecca with Ayman. And when they arrive in Mecca, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how much he must have cried those nights and how he must have felt. But then he is given to Abdul Muttalib. And at the age of 6, Abdul Muttalib brings him into his care, who was a respected leader of Mecca, who loved the Prophet ﷺ so much. Abdul Muttalib was a remarkable man. He was a very devout individual, moral, ethical individual. He was upright, brave, noble individual. And he was a leader of all the Quraysh tribe. He was not just the head of Banu Hashim, but all the other families of the Quraysh. And so many people of Arabia, especially the area of Al-Hijaz, referred to Abdul Muttalib as the most powerful Arab man. But Abdul Muttalib was also a very busy man. He had many affairs to take care of, including raising his own children. But he also had to take time to take care of his grandson, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, what would he do in this situation? What would we do in this situation? I'm a leader of an entire tribe, an entire people. and I have no time to take care of my own kids. Let me call up a nanny. Let me dial up and find a maid to take care of my children. But he didn't do this. As a matter of fact, he made it a priority that I'm going to take care of the Prophet ﷺ myself. He was under the guardianship of Abdul Muttalib. He was more kind and affectionate with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ than he was with his own children. He knew there was something special about that boy. Abdul Muttalib would always look for the Prophet ﷺ and draw the Prophet ﷺ near to him. He would always check on his grandson. Abdul Muttalib would never go to sleep first until he checks that his grandson is asleep first. And there's a Bedouin man by the name of Kindir ibn Sa'id. He said that one day he comes to near the Kaaba and he sees Abdul Muttalib reading lines of poetry and saying, you know, return Muhammad to me. Oh, Muhammad, where have you gone? Return to me, return to me. Now what had happened was some camels of Abdul Muttalib went missing. With Abdul Muttalib, there's always something going on with camels, whether it's with Abraha and the elephants here. There's always something going on. And so he tasked the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with the task of going to find the camels, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Abdul Muttalib, says that I never sent him out on an errand in which he didn't succeed. But this time it took him too long. Abdul Muttalib got a little nervous. And so he was making dua. Oh, return Muhammad to me. Oh Allah, return Muhammad to me. Return Muhammad to me. And so he was very worried that something happened to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now shortly after, the Prophet ﷺ, he comes back with the camels. Now, he wasn't going to fail any mission in life. The Prophet ﷺ. And so Abdul Muttalib, he was so overjoyed, and he said that from this day, from this moment, you and I will never be separated again. There was a seat that was reserved for Abdul Muttalib, right underneath the shade of the Kaaba. A special seat, a seat that is only given to people of honor. And so there was a cushion, a mattress, that was placed next to the Kaaba. And Abdul Muttalib would sit there, he would lean against the Kaaba, he would greet people there, he would meet visitors and residents of Mecca there. It was a special seat, like a throne. No one would dare to sit there, not even his own children. His sons would sit around Abdul Muttalib, but nobody would actually ever sit on the seat. And so then here comes this child, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a little kid, who would run right up on his grandfather's cushion and sit right in the middle of the seat. And kids do that kind of thing, you know. They think they can get away with things, so they just go. And his uncles, his other uncles, would grab at him. Say, get down from there. You know, like you see a mother yelling at her child at the grocery store when he's grabbing candy. Put that away. And so this is the same thing that's happening right now. So his uncles are trying to grab at the Prophet. Get down, you're not supposed to sit there. And then Abdul Muttalib, he saw this and he said, no, leave my boy alone. Let Muhammad sit there. Look at him. He looks like a king. He literally says this, he looks like a king. And I swear by Allah, there's something special about this boy. Then Abdul Muttalib, he would come, he would pick up the Prophet ﷺ, he would sit on the seat and he would sit him on his lap. And Abdul Muttalib would just look at the boy with admiration. And he would just sit there and he would rub the back of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And Abdul Muttalib, if you ever see, you know, witness someone who loves their kids or loves their grandkids, oftentimes they just sit there and they just are looking at whatever their kid is doing, and it might be something silly and mundane, like they're just throwing around a ball or they're grabbing some cardboard and just throwing it around, and you look at the parent and they just have the most beautiful smile on their face. And that's exactly what Abdul Muttalib was like. Just looking at the Prophet ﷺ doing any normal thing that a kid would do and just having a goofy smile on his face while he's doing it. And so one time there was a man who came to Mecca to visit Abdul Muttalib. And while the man was meeting with Abdul Muttalib, he started staring at the Prophet ﷺ the whole time. And so he said to Abdul Muttalib, take care of this child. The way this child carries himself, the way he talks, you can tell he's going to be someone great. He's going to be someone special. He's meant for greatness. So be careful with this child. So when Abdul Muttalib heard this, he immediately called for his most trusted and responsible son, Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and told him, listen to what this man has to say about your nephew. And so Abu Talib had the man repeat to what he said about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And then Abdul Muttalib, he told Abu Talib, from now on, I want the Prophet Muhammad under your care, because I'm not going to be around for much longer. And it will be your responsibility to take care of this child after I die. You know, some history books actually mention that Abdul Muttalib lived to be almost 153 years old. He lived a very long life. And if you study the life of Abdul Muttalib, it actually kind of makes sense. There's a lot of things that happen in his life and a lot of events and phenomena that happen in his life. It required a very long life for someone like him. So Abu Talib, he went to Barakah, Ayman, one of the Prophet ﷺ's nurse mothers, and said, Ya Barakah, this son of mine, don't ever be neglectful of him. It's common with Arabs that the uncle will call his nephew his son. It's common. He says, my father specifically put me in charge of him. Make sure you always take care of him. Keep an eye on him. I've seen him play with the other boys, and they were playing on the outskirts of Mecca, and I went to check on them. And while they were playing, I saw some of the Ahl Kitab, the Christians and the Jews, pass by, and they were encamped there. And they were also watching this boy very closely. And I heard them talking, and they think that this nephew of mine is a prophet of this ummah. Regardless of if this is true or not, a lot of people will have their attention on him. Some might mean him good, and some might mean him harm. So this is why we must be very diligent to him at all times. Now 2 years later, at the age of 8 years old, Abdul Muttalib leaves. The Prophet ﷺ's grandfather passes away. And before passing away, Abdul Muttalib called all of his children for a gathering to distribute his inheritance and responsibilities. And he emphasized that my last and most important request is to Abu Talib to take care of Muhammad, my grandson. And Ayman, Barakah, she says that when Abdul Muttalib was being sent for burial, I saw Rasulullah's face buried in his hands, and he was crying, going through another tragedy. He constantly went through difficulty at a young age. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was preparing him for the great challenges that lie ahead. He taught him to be patient and connected with Allah. That your only constant is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People will come and go. And that's also why the Prophet ﷺ was such a beacon of love, a beacon of kindness, because even with all the tragedy and death that was going on in his life, in his childhood, he was never emotionally deprived. And this shows through his affection to his wives, his children, his grandchildren, other family members and friends. The Prophet ﷺ was so beloved by his family and his people that even though his closest ones were leaving, he still had love around him. And this is an important lesson for us as well. Don't get attached to any one human being too much. Because one of two things is always going to happen. Either you leave or they leave. And when they leave, your heart will break and you'll be in tears. And that's okay. We talked about how the Prophet ﷺ was in tears when his mother left and when he visited his mother's graves, and being in touch with your emotions is absolutely something that we should all do. But connect with Allah in those moments. Remember that Allah is the one who is the only constant. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said to Musa alayhi salam, who was expelled from his hometown, both as a child and an adult, وَاصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي, I have chosen you for myself. And so similarly, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is left in Allah's care. He's left in Allah's nurture. Now, growing up in such a harsh environment, it develops one's maturity, one's forbearance, patience, and humility. It makes someone a good leader. And so the Prophet ﷺ said that I and the one who takes care of an orphan will be like this in paradise. And he put his index and middle finger together. The closeness. So go back to the beginning when we spoke about jumping at the opportunity of taking care of an orphan when it's ever presented to us. And he, Rasulullah ﷺ, was not just speaking from a place of fact, but also from a place of true empathy and understanding for what it means to be an orphan. And so after Abdul Muttalib passes away, he is put in the care of Abu Talib. And inshallah ta'ala, we will pause here for Maghrib, and after Maghrib we will return inshallah ta'ala so that we can finish today's session. Inshallah. So if we can have Faris give the adhan, and we'll be back after Maghrib Salah, inshallah. So we left off with Abdul Muttalib being the one who is now, Abu Talib being the one who is now taking over the responsibility of taking care of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, why Abu Talib and not, maybe like Abu Lahab, who's the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who will later be an enemy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or another uncle? Well, the reason that Abdul Muttalib wanted Abu Talib specifically was because Abdul Muttalib, he had multiple wives. And the only person that shared a mother with Abdullah, the father of the Prophet, is Abu Talib. So Abu Talib and Abdullah, they shared the same mother. And that mother, her name is Fatima bint Amr. So he was given over to Abu Talib in order for him to take care of. And Abu Talib, he took care of Rasulullah ﷺ in a, what can you say, an absolutely amazing fashion. There's no words to put together of how well he carried out that responsibility. So a little bit about Abu Talib. Abu Talib, he was a very simple man. He was a zahid. He wasn't as wealthy as one would expect a man of his status to be. Because we talked about how this family didn't like to use their influences to gain wealth, but they liked to use their connection influences to help their people instead. And zuhud means that someone who has no connection to desire, to worldly or materialistic things. They didn't really care for money, they didn't care for wealth, they didn't have that connection to the worldly life. But Abu Talib, he loved his nephew, Rasulullah ﷺ, immensely. Similar to Abdul Muttalib, sometimes it seemed like Abu Talib loved his own child more than his own children, or the Prophet ﷺ more than his own children. And so the Prophet ﷺ was 8 years old when he was taken in by his uncle. Abu Talib was one of those who he wouldn't go to sleep until he checked that the Prophet ﷺ was safe. He would lie next to the Prophet ﷺ and make sure that he hugs him to sleep before he gets up and he moves away. He was one of those who would not eat until the Prophet ﷺ had eaten. When he would go and sit down to eat, what would happen is sometimes, because Abu Talib had so many children, they would all come together, and if anybody, has a lot of brothers, you'll know that when the food is laid down, you got like 10 minutes max before it's all gone. So you gotta go. So this is what happened in Abu Talib's household a lot. The food comes down and everybody like vultures, right? One time we were at a restaurant, Chili's in Egypt, and we used to love, when we were kids, we used to love getting the molten lava cake. Me, my brothers, and my cousins, right? So we're like 8, 9 guys. And so one time my dad was with us, and he saw that literally when the molten lava cake came on the table, it just like 9 guys swarmed it. And then by the time we opened back up, the lava cake was gone. And he was like, what the heck just happened? And it happened in the span of like 30 seconds. So this is reality. This happens. So the Prophet ﷺ being, someone who was a little bit more, maybe a little bit more softer, who's a little bit more timid at times, there was incidents where he did not get food at all. And so this would really disturb Abu Talib. So now, from here on out, he decided that if the food comes down, the Prophet ﷺ is the one who eats first. No one touches the fries, no one touches the molten lava cake until the Prophet ﷺ gets his bite first. And so the Prophet ﷺ would sit and eat with them. And there was miracles that would happen where Abu Talib, again, he didn't have a lot. And so whenever he would serve his family food, they would eat enough, but it wasn't really like to their fill. It was like more just like to keep their back straight, like just for some nourishment, and then you got to continue. But somehow, whenever the Prophet ﷺ was involved in the eating, everybody would be full. There seemed to be more food than was actually there. There was barakah, there was blessing in the food. And so the Prophet, Abu Talib, would always just sit there looking at his nephew with admiration and saying, my son, there's something special about you. You know, when people would wake up in the morning, they'd have a bit of gunk in their eyes, their hair would be messy, maybe they got drool coming down their face. You know, when kids wake up in the morning, that mess. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would wake up in the morning, his hair was perfect. His eyes were bright and clean, no gunk or redness in his eyes. His eyes would look like it had kuhl on them. And so the Prophet ﷺ, from a young age, he always had this dignified manner of behaving. So even though in the morning Abu Talib's other children would fight for the food that the mother had put out, the Prophet ﷺ would stand aside quietly and calmly. So Abu Talib would go and get the food for Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. There's also narrations that say that if there was ever like a big piece of chicken or like a nice piece of meat, they would always give it to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And there's a narration that is authenticated by Ibn Asakir, very famous, notable, renowned Syrian muhaddith, scholar of hadith. And this is narrated by Julhuma bin Urfuta, who came to Mecca during a drought. And he heard the people of Quraysh complaining to Abu Talib about this drought. The children are hungry, our animals are dying, our children are dying. Please pray for rain. Oh, Abu Talib, pray for rain. And so Abu Talib, he came out because Abu Talib, you know, unfortunately we know that Abu Talib was someone who worshipped idols, but he was pious. He was seen as religious in his community. So they would seek Abu Talib's du'as. So Abu Talib, he gets the Prophet ﷺ and he goes outside. And he leans the Prophet ﷺ against the Kaaba where there's shade so the Prophet ﷺ can remain shaded. And he starts looking at the sun and he makes dua. But then this individual looks at Rasulullah ﷺ and sees something very special happen. Well, Rasulullah ﷺ, this young boy, he points at the sky while looking at the sun. Bright sun. No clouds in the sky. He points at the sky, and as soon as he points at the sky, clouds start coming from different directions. And it begins to pour down rain to the point where the valley begins to flow with rain, and it became abundant city of rain, Mecca, during that day. And people became so overjoyed, and the town became so overjoyed. And Abu Talib, he turns around, he sees this happening. And he says a beautiful poem. وَأَبْيَضَ يُسْتَسْقَى الْغَمَامُ بِوَجْهِهِ. That radiant one by whose face rain is beckoned. Talking about the Prophet ﷺ. ثِمَالَ الْيَتَامَ عِصْمَةً لِلْأَرَامِلِ. Shelter for orphans and support for widows. يَلُوذُ بِهِ الْهُلَاكُ مِنْ آلِ هَاشِمٍ. That the desperate of Bani Hashim seek him. فَهُمْ عِنْدَهُ فِي نِعْمَةٍ وَفَوَاضِلٍ. And find themselves in bounty and surplus. Now in order to conclude today's session, I wanted to mention a woman who does not get enough recognition for her critical role in the upbringing of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and that is the mother of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the wife of Abu Talib. Her name is Fatima bint Asad, who actually later accepts Islam. We'll see later on Abu Talib does not accept Islam, and in our belief, he is considered the greatest of the disbelievers. Right? So just because someone's a disbeliever doesn't mean they're a bad person. People can be good people and not accept Islam at the same time. So he's the greatest of the disbelievers. We believe this. But Fatima bint Asad, the wife of Abu Talib, does end up accepting Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ himself, in a narration recorded in the Tabarani al-Kabir al-Awsat, he says that the most beloved to me in my childhood after Abu Talib was his wife Fatima bint Asad. And Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anh said that when Fatima bint Asad, the mother of Ali radiallahu anh, passed away, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam visited her house. He sat beside her body and he said, "My dear mother, may Allah have mercy upon you and keep you under His protection. After my mother, you loved me as a caring mother loves her child. Many times you went hungry in order to feed me well. You clothed me and fed me on delicacies that you denied yourself, hoping to attain the pleasure and rewards of Allah and the success in the hereafter. And Rasulullah ﷺ then ordered that she be washed 3 times, done ghusl 3 times. One of them with water that was mixed with camphor, right? Like the scented water. And he poured it with his own hands. And after this, he took off his qamis, which is a long shirt that he was wearing over another shirt. And he put it on her, and he shrouded her in that garment. And then he asked Usama bin Zayd and Abu Ayyub al-Ansari and Umar ibn Khattab to dig up a grave for her. And when they reached the area of the grave where they have to carve out the niche inside the grave which the body will be placed, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam stopped them from digging. He went into the grave himself and he made the space for the niche of the grave. Now one narration says that he actually laid himself in that niche for a moment and he made a supplication before Fatima was put into the grave. He says, "O Allah, you are the one in whose power is death and life and for whom there is no end. Forgive my mother, Fatima. O Allah, make her house of the hereafter vast. And I beseech you in the name of your Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and all the past prophets. O Allah, the most merciful of the merciful ones." And after this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Allahu Akbar," very loudly 3 times. And so with the help of Al-Abbas and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhum, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam laid her inside this niche and covered her grave. And one narration, the companions saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam do what he did in the grave, and they were astonished. They said, "You have never done this for anyone before." And he replied, he said, "I clothed her in my shirt as a shroud so that she would be clothed of the clothes of paradise. And I laid in her grave so that the squeeze of the grave would be easier for her." Now pause. Something we know from other narrations and other sources that Rasulullah ﷺ tells us that everybody's going to experience a squeezing of a grave. Right? So when you go into the grave is going to come squeeze you. Now depending on your deeds and your sins, the severity of that squeeze is going to vary. So if you were a righteous person, the best case scenario is that that squeeze will feel like a hug. Worst case scenario, and I'm sorry to be graphic, but this is what the narration says. Worst case scenario is that your ribs will come together and the hand motion like this was made, right? Like your fingers coming together. That's very severe squeezing. That's the worst case scenario, and they're the best case scenario. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from the squeezing and the punishment of the grave. Now about 12 years old to mid-teens, there was an interesting incident that took place. And this is the incident in where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam travels on business with Abu Talib to Sham, and he meets the monk Bahira. We covered a lot today, so yes. So the question is, did the Prophet ﷺ have aunts, and how were they involved in his life, essentially? Yeah, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ did have aunts, and we can talk about that, inshallah, next week. I can do some research on specifically how they were involved and things like that, inshallah ta'ala. Yes, Muhammad.
You said he was the first orphan. How do you know that?
He's the first orphan of this ummah, right? Of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah. Wording. Tricky. Yeah. Yes. Any other questions? No questions from Amadou today? That's crazy. MashaAllah. I'm joking. Alright, jazakallah khair everyone. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala mursalin. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.